New York City's Lower East Side in the 1980s was a whole different world altogether. Known as one of New York City's oldest neighborhoods, the area would undergo massive changes over the last 40 years. But exactly how different was the Lower East Side from the one that you know today? The Lower East Side is comprised of some of the following areas: Chinatown, the Bowery, Alphabet City, Little Italy, and Two Bridges. While the Lower East Side, also known as the LES, is known for its Jewish history in the early 1900s, it wasn't until the 1960s that the Lower East Side would begin to develop into the Lower East Side that many speak so fondly of today. A place rich for culture and a mix of different people from different parts of the world. Despite the heavy crime, drugs, homelessness, and the landlord-driven fires that would bring abandoned buildings to the ground, the area would begin to draw residents who were musicians and artists, among other things. By the time the mid-70s rolled around, the Lower East Side was known as its own place with its own identity, separate from that of the greater New York City. Known as a central hub for all things creative, the Lower East Side became home to the sounds of hardcore punk and other forms of entertainment. But the hardcore scene would come with a message, and they delivered it loudly. Residents from all over the city would come to the Lower East Side and witness acts like Cro-Mags, Bad Brains, Black Flag, and many others. All while the scene would change the landscape of heavy, aggressive music forever. Venues like CBGB and the Peppermint Lounge were filled with avid listeners who all came from similar tribes. Aside from the hardcore scene, you had individuals who just wanted to fit in with people they could connect with and who might be in the same boat as they were. Maybe just trying to get by, or maybe chasing a dream. The area already built up a reputation for some of the reasons already mentioned, and on August 6 of 1988, the Tompkins Square Park riots would further strengthen the idea that the Lower East Side wasn't just any other neighborhood, and not for the faint of heart. Violence erupted between civilians and officers. Some officers covered their shields to avoid being identified. Many were hurt, and some of those attacked by the cops had nothing to do with the riot. They were just walking through the area or sitting on their front stoops of their apartment buildings. All this was, of course, before the Lower East Side would become notoriously gentrified. The area was slowly but surely being cemented into history, but not everyone who came out here to chase a dream was so lucky. Some were caught in the web of New York City's dark underbelly, with no way to escape it. Today, on Evil Intentions, the story of Monika Beerle. Monika Beerle was a 26-year-old dancer from Switzerland. She was raised in the city of St. Gallen, a city with a population of only about 70 to 80,000 people when she was being raised in the 60s. This particular city, well known for having the most beautiful medieval castles in the world, known for its ski resorts, the Abbey Library of St. Gall, which houses the oldest collection of literature in Switzerland, and the Natural History Museum of St. Gallen, just to name a few. Monika had plans of coming to the big city and chasing her dreams of being a dancer. She received a certificate for teaching and choreography from the Juice Leader School of Dance at Darrington Hall in Devon. She was described as an energetic spirit who always wanted to push her life and her art to the limits. And in 1985, after receiving a scholarship from the Swiss government, Beerle would make her way to New York City. While in New York City, Monika would put her scholarship to good use and attended the Martha Graham School of Contemporary Dance. She attended 2 to 3 classes a day. She enrolled in school in 1985, but left back to Switzerland in 1987 to tend to her ailing mother and to do a tour of her own dance routines. She toured in 8 different cities, places like Zurich, Lucerne, and Basel. She was deeply talented, according to Alison Sherman, a spokeswoman for the Martha Graham School. To make a living, Monika would start dancing at go-go bars on Times Square. back when sex shops and sex workers on the street was routine. Among the places she danced was Billy's Topless, located on 24th Street in New York City's Chelsea neighborhood, a small location that resembled more of a bar rather than a strip club. Billy's only contained a small bar and a little over 20 chairs that would surround the stage. A modest establishment, but enough for Monika to keep financially stable. She was very close to her family and spent a lot of time talking about them. Her family and the art of dance were the two things that Monika truly couldn't live without. She was focused and nothing could get in her way. In the summer of 1989, Monika would find herself down in the Lower East Side, a place she frequented often when she would meet with friends and pass by to purchase marijuana. She also lived there. At the time, she was living by herself at 171 Avenue B after leaving her old apartment at 93 Orchard Street. This is where she met Daniel Rakowitz, a traveling hippie, marijuana enthusiast, and part-time drug dealer from Edna, Texas, also the son of a Texas deputy sheriff. Rakowitz was described as a troubled soul who had his first brush with grief at an early age, witnessing his mother suffer a fatal heart attack in a hotel room. His father would later marry Rakowitz's aunt, the sister of his deceased wife, but this too would come to an end. Over the years, loved ones of Daniel would mention his darker moments as a teenager, becoming addicted to drugs. He would make his way from Texas to Missouri, and finally to New York City's Lower East Side. There, he earned the nickname Chicken Man. People of the area recall Rakowitz having a pet rooster and sometimes walking through the park with a dead chicken wrapped around his neck. Rakowitz earned his money as a dishwasher and worked odd jobs while he couch surfed over the years, trying to find stability. He finally found his footing and began staying at 700 East 9th Street, just a few blocks away from the park. On the front door to the apartment was written, "Welcome to Charlie Gein's Spawn Ranch East," a combination of the names Ed Gein and Charles Manson. When the two met, they shared a joint and discussed living in the city. Monika was looking for a bigger place when Daniel suggested that she move into the apartment with him and the others that were also residing there. She could afford it and it gave her the chance to have a better space. She accepted and the two celebrated over a few more joints. She also paid off Daniel's back rent so that he was all caught up and he wouldn't get thrown out. Daniel had fears of becoming homeless again and dreaded the idea. When he had chances to earn income, he would visit a slaughterhouse and buy chickens, sometimes 20 at a time, slaughter them and cook them up in a soup. Then he would take that soup or whatever he cooked and pass it out to the homeless men, women, and children at Tompkins Square Park. If he couldn't earn the money, he would go to a nearby supermarket and ask for change, and use that to buy ingredients for food. He knew what it was like to be homeless, and although it wasn't a place to rest their head, the inhabitants of Tent City would appreciate his kind gestures. Tent City was what they named Tompkins Square Park. The first week of August 1989, Monika's belongings showed up to the apartment and the move was underway. According to a friend who also lived at the residence, a woman by the name of Sylvia, Daniel prepared for Monika's arrival in a way she hadn't seen before. He had cleaned up the home in tip-top shape so that her arrival was as comfortable as possible. And on one occasion, Sylvia came home and found herself knocking to get in when Daniel took a while to answer. When he did, he was adjusting his zipper and pants and said that he was busy. He would go on to introduce Sylvia to Monika and explain that she would be moving in and taking over the lease. The next day, Sylvia and Monika had a conversation, and Sylvia decided to ask Monika about her and Daniel's relationship, since everything was moving so fast, and Daniel was never known to have women in the home. I asked her the next day because I thought Daniel was playing a joke. I said, "Daniel told me he went with you." Monika's reply, "He did." A short, serious response. The two had a brief sexual relationship that lasted just a few weeks. During that time, Sylvia would tell Daniel that Monika's affection for him was only as real as her desire to grab the apartment from under him, now that the rental was under her name. Daniel, in denial that he was being used, responded defensively, "No, but she cares about me, and she wants to live with me, and she wants to be my roommate." Sylvia's response, "Daniel, she wants the apartment, and she's gonna take the apartment right from underneath you. She's gonna have the lease in her name, and once it's in her name, she's gonna throw you out. And I ain't gonna be here anymore, and there's nothing I can say when the lease is changed over. So if she throws you out, you're out, and you're homeless again." Daniel responded that he loved Monika. Nothing could change his mind. While Daniel was falling in love, Monika didn't feel the same for Daniel. She broke off the sexual part of their relationship almost immediately and began inviting other men to the apartment. On one occasion, she invited a Jamaican man to spend the night with her. Daniel would later tell Sylvia she had a black man in there. She would go on to say that he looked hurt and seemed to be very upset at this. This was because Daniel had a deep and sometimes well-hidden distaste for anyone who wasn't white, and also wasn't fond of the gay community. So while he may be pictured with people from all walks of life, he didn't exactly see them as equals. His hatred ran deep. Rakowitz would often begin ranting and talking about how he was God. He even started what was believed to be his own religion/cult, which he coined the Church of 966. He would talk about animal sacrifice, and it was believed that sometime before, Rakowitz had even decapitated a dog that he owned. He would talk about being placed in psychiatric wards at a young age and being forced to take Ritalin from the ages 9 to 11. According to him, he was bullied by other kids, being beaten and spat on. If he defended himself, he would get beat worse by his father. As the days went on and Rakowitz, who Monika barely knew, became more and more strange, her friends urged her to get him out of the home, since he was always saying something that they just couldn't understand. His constant rants about the government and being God didn't sit well with others, and having Church of 966 written on the walls in chicken's blood definitely didn't help. Daniel pleaded and begged in every single way that he could to get back into Monika's good graces. He tried changing her mind, but her mind was already made up. Daniel needed to go. He began to understand the severity of his living situation, and his worst fears began to creep back into his head. He would be homeless again, and all his good deeds would be forgotten. His nights of watching television hours on end, a habit he'd picked up since finally settling in a home, were close to coming to an end. I'm gonna kill her. No, I love her. I'm not gonna kill her. Those are the alarming words that exited Daniel's mouth when it became clear that he would find himself on the street again. The others who lived in the apartment at the time didn't take Daniel's plan serious. He said so much in the past that this just seemed like another crazy thing he said. On August 12th of 1989, Sylvia would flat out tell Monika what Daniel had been saying. When learning about Daniel's violent plan for her, she would laugh, walk up to Daniel in front of Sylvia, and simply say, "I'll kill you first." About a week later, Rakowitz had been walking Sylvia to a nearby PATH train and explained that he couldn't take Monika anymore. He was going to kill her the next day, and he wanted Sylvia to come back and help him dispose of the body. Sylvia, of course, wanted no parts of this and told him that he was crazy for even thinking that she would assist. She paid it no mind and she went about her business, not returning to the city until that Saturday. When she returned, she stared up at the window of Monika's apartment and saw that the lights were out. This was unusual since there was normally someone home. She could feel that something was terribly wrong. Despite her gut feelings, she pushed them aside and went upstairs anyway. As she walked up to the stairs, she could hear that Daniel's TV was powered on, with the volume at full blast. She opened the door and could see Daniel's TV on the kitchen counter, the area dimly lit by the television. She checked her old room to make sure that her old belongings were in good shape, but noticed that Monika's door was closed. She knocked, but there was no answer. When she returned to the kitchen, this time entering, not just seeing it from a distance, she noticed a big pot on the stove, and inside the pot was the head of Monika Beerle. The head was burnt and the eyes were shut. Shocked by the finding, Sylvia made her way to the bathroom. She stood right outside of it and looked in. What she saw turned her stomach, and the reality finally set in. Rakowitz had really done it. She saw Monika's ribcage lying in the bathtub, with all the skin and flesh torn from the bone. Surrounding the upper torso were Monika's guts submerged in her own blood. Sylvia immediately left the apartment and ran to a nearby phone booth on Avenue A, and she called Daniel's beeper. When he returned the call, she would ask, "Daniel, you did it?" His response, "You saw it, Sylvia? I'm sorry you had to see it, but I had to do it." The two met at Tompkins Square Park, where he continued to apologize for what she had seen and further explain what had happened. Daniel went on to explain that he wasn't alone when he committed the murder. He was with a friend from a satanic church in the Brooklyn section of New York. Monika had told Rakowitz that he had to leave the apartment by the next day, If he refused to leave, her friend with a pit bull would be arriving to help her force him out. She went back to her room and Daniel's friend would ask, "What? You haven't killed her yet?" Monika came back out and began to yell at his friend, since she wasn't fond of Daniel or the company he kept. As she walked away, turning her back to walk toward her bedroom, Daniel grabbed an extension cord and wrapped it around Monika's neck, violently pulling her toward him, and then grabbing her by the throat with his bare hands. He began to strangle the 26-year-old dancer until her body no longer moved. Monika tried her best to fight Daniel off, scratching him up and down his arms. After choking Monika to death, he stomped on her head about 10 times and then stabbed her more than 30 times. He would go on to cut off her head, cut off her arms and legs, and left her remains in the blood-soaked tub while he figured out what to do next. Rakowitz then used a solid steel pole to break her bones, followed by a 13-inch carving knife to cut up her body into small pieces. He then began flushing her remains down the toilet and saved some in the fridge. He would then consume parts of her body over the next 10 days. After that, Monika's remains began to badly decompose in the late summer heat. This prompted Daniel to begin removing the rest of the skin and flesh from the body. He then began bleaching her bones and skull to rid it of any lingering smells. As if those details aren't horrific enough, rumors began to circulate that Daniel had boiled Monika's head and flesh, made her remains into a soup that he would then pass out to the homeless people in Tompkins Square Park. He had done this many times before, only this time, anyone in Tompkins Square Park who had accepted Daniel's kind gesture could now consider themselves cannibals. He told Sylvia, who at this time hadn't said anything out of pure fear, that he would be cleaning up the scene so that she could return to the home one day for a visit. She dropped by and Monika's skull was still in the apartment, this time resembling that of an anatomical skull used in classrooms. Whenever he would recall Monika and get angry, he would spit on Monika's skull and say, "Well, hey, bitch, at least you always have a home. She looks more beautiful now than she ever did." After cleaning the apartment for hours and leaving it free of any evidence, Rakowitz then took a bucket containing Monika's skull, bones, and kitty litter to absorb any lingering smell. The bucket was then transported to the baggage check facility at the Port Authority bus terminal. He placed it in a storage locker where nobody could find it. It would be a month before authorities began to pursue any leads in Monika's disappearance. This was due to her not appearing for classes and not returning any calls from back home. This was very unusual for Monika. On top of this, Daniel had begun to talk about Monika's brutal murder and dismemberment to anybody who would listen. Information quickly spread, and it became apparent that this was no longer some Lower East Side urban legend. Even the claims that were believed to be exaggerated, like the claims of Monika's remains being turned into a soup and given to the homeless for dinner, were confirmed. They were confirmed when a man who lived in Tompkins Square Park testified that when eating the soup, he found a knuckle floating among the vegetables and potatoes. Rakowitz also claimed to have tasted her brains and thinking it tasted, quote-unquote, pretty good. He told numerous people he had eaten Monika's remains more than once, despite recanting his claims later on. Rakowitz had told everyone and anyone about the murder before and after he committed it. As shocking and sadistic as the bloody scene was, there was no question. Rakowitz had officially gone off the deep end. On Monday, September 18th, detectives visited the home on 9th Street and found Sylvia there. They told her they knew what happened from a neighbor and from another member of the household, a man by the name of Sean. This, of course, was a lie. The cops knew nothing and used this tactic as a way to draw information from Sylvia, who told them everything they wanted to know. After the arrest, Daniel was brought into custody where he confessed to the brutal execution and dismemberment of Monika Beerle. On February of 1991, Daniel Rakowitz was found not guilty by reason of insanity. He was then moved to a state hospital for the criminally insane, where he still resides till this day. That friend he had mentioned earlier on, a man by the name of Randy Charles Easterday, was nabbed in February of 1992 for taking part in the murder, but was released shortly after since the district attorney didn't have enough evidence to hold him. Rest in peace, Monika Beerle. Thank you guys so much for stopping by and watching today's video. This particular story is a crazy one for me because that's an area I'm very familiar with. Spent a lot of time there in my youth, playing shows, went to school in the area. Being around older people, I'd sometimes heard about these kinds of stories, but you hear it in passing and it's not something that you take very serious. You think it's just people talking about these urban myths. But sure enough, I started doing this type of content, and what do I come across? This case, automatically get flashbacks thinking back to all the stuff I'd heard before. Now, what do you guys think? Do you think you'd be able to keep this type of secret? Do you think you'd be able to be around a friend who committed this type of crime and keep it to yourself? Would it be more because you feel you have a loyalty to them, or would it be more because you're just fearful? I'm going to say that for a lot of people, it would be the latter. Now, this is something I should start saying in the beginning of my videos, but if you're a new viewer, please feel free to like and subscribe. Hit the bell notification just so you can see when my new content goes up. The algorithm can be quite tricky. Of course, if you're just passing through, that's okay too. I appreciate every view. I appreciate all you guys who support. Now, friends, always remember, keep a tight circle, mind your surroundings, and don't be so quick to trust those you just met, because you never know who around you might have evil intentions. I'm out.